Chapter 1: Thinking Critically About History. My goal is to provide a variety of ways of viewing educational history as a means of sparking critical thinking about history in schools. Consequently, I provide throughout the text a variety of interpretations of American school history ranging from conservative to leftists. Like historians who weave together the drama of the past, consumers of history have their own political and social opinions that they impose on historical events. Readers should ask themselves about how their personal beliefs determine their interpretations of historical events. This chapter will discuss interpreting school history from right to left, purposes of educational history and its effect on public images and emotions regarding school, themes in American educational history, globalization framework, the effect of cultural and religious differences on schools, religious debates in the U.S. schools from the colonial era to the present, schools and the culture wars, schools as managers of public thought, racial and ethnic conflict as a theme in school history, the role in educational history of equality and opportunity and human capital, globalization, consumer and environmental education. Interpreting school history from the right to the left. Is there a correct interpretation of historical events? A correct and precise historical interpretation is often difficult to arrive at given the wide range of lives and events during any particular time period. For instance, we know that there was an 18th century American Revolution against England which had a profound effect on the development of schools, but why was there a revolution? What did the people in the colonies think about the revolution? What were the concerns of European settlers, Native Americans, and enslaved Africans concerning the Revolutionary War? What was the effect of the American independence and educational development? These and a host of other questions are debated among historians, with answers often reflecting on the political and social opinions of the particular historian. Many readers of history assume that there is a correct interpretation of history. This attitude is often a reflection of studying a single standardized American history text in elementary and high school. History is often presented to young students within a single interpretive framework, with little suggestion of the existence of alternative historical interpretations. Consider the debate, as I discuss in Chapter 3, 4, and 5, over why public schools were created in the 1830s and 1840s. Historians might agree on dates and personalities involved in historical events, but they might not agree about motives. Were public schools established to ensure that all citizens would be able to protect their political and economic rights? Were public schools established to protect the power of an elite by controlling the economic and political ideas taught to students? Were public schools established to ensure the dominance of Protestant Anglo-American culture over Native American, Irish American, and African American cultures? Were public schools necessary to ensure the education of the whole population? These questions raise issues that are debated in the writing of history. All of these questions have been asked at the creation and the expansion of public schools. Historical debates about schools are reflected in current educational concerns. Today is a concern, as it was in the 19th century, is about whether schools will end poverty. Many other debates from the 19th century are reflected in today's struggles over educational policy. Should today's public school curriculum attempt to promote a single national culture or multicultural society? What social and political values should be taught in today's public schools? Should public schools supplant parental power, or should parents be given a wide variety of choices such as homeschooling and alternative institutions? Will education strengthen the answer to global economic competition? Should public schools teach values that might be in conflict with home values? What knowledge is most worth teaching? By engaging in an intellectual dialogue about historical interpretations, readers should be able to clarify their opinion about educational institutions and their relationship of education to other institutions and to social events. Purposes of educational history and its effect on public image and emotions regarding schools. History can serve multiple purposes. It can be read and taught to establish or to strengthen a person's identification with a nation, community, family, ethnic group, religion, or other social group. Or it can serve a moral purpose by condemning or admiring certain historical events. History can be approached analytically, wherein the historian or student tries to discern why historical events took place. And finally, history can serve social and political purposes such as creating loyalty to a government or preparing citizens to actively participate in social change. The history of American schools can serve all of these purposes. This book emphasizes why analytical approach with the goal of educating a reader who will have the knowledge to actively participate in improving educational policies. This analytical approach encompasses issues of both identity and moral judgments. Regarding identity, after reading this book, school staff, students, parents, and other citizens should be able to walk through an American school and identify the historical origins of a present school practice. Sometimes there is a gasp of recognition on the part of the student of school history. Oh, that's why the schools do that. Consequently, readers who have attended or are working in American schools might find their identity with American schools strengthened. Whenever we hear what that history tells us who we are, write Keith Barton and Linda Levstick in their study of the variety of reasons for teaching history, we are dealing with some version of the identification stance. In other words, current conditions can be seen as mirroring past events. There is also a moral element to the analytical approach that often leaves the reader with mixed feelings about the past. The reader might approve of certain aspects of school history, such as educating the informed voter, providing equality of opportunity in the labor market, improving public health practices, or fighting crime. On the other hand, the reader might find other aspects of school history morally offensive, such as the denial of education to enslaved Africans, the attempt to use education to destroy Native American cultures, the Protestant religious bias of early public schools, or racial segregation. In other words, the history of American schools will cause mixed emotional responses. It is not just a history of heroines, heroes, triumphant accomplishes. Yes, there were those who dedicated themselves to schooling the public for the common good. But there were those who believed schooling could serve their own personal or group interests by educating compliant workers and voters, destroying cultures and languages, and perpetuating their own power. The answer to historical questions have implications for a person's future, choices, and actions. The answers shape images and feelings about the past. Many people do not remember the details of history, but they do develop images and emotions about past events. For instance, the attitudes and feelings about public schools of a person who concludes that public schools were established to protect the political and economic rights of citizens will be quite different from the attitudes of a person who concludes that public schools were established to protect the political and economic power of an elite. Or, if a person concludes that the establishment of public schools was necessary for the education of all children, then that person's attitudes regarding privatization of schools will be quite different from those of someone who concludes the opposite. Thinking about history involves an intellectual consideration of conflicting interpretations, emotions, and images of public schools. For example, at an early age, a person might be taught a history that is designed to foster an emotional attachment in the form of patriotism to the political and economic organizations of the United States. Later in life, this person's emotional feelings about the United States might be challenged if the person reads a critical history. One's knowledge, images, and emotions regarding the past have an impact on future actions. Individuals often make decisions based on what they believe to be the historical purposes and goals of an institution. The varieties of interpretations presented in this book provide readers with an opportunity to think about the past events in a manner that might influence their future actions. As suggested, these differing interpretations might elicit conflicting feelings of approval, outrage, or disbelief. Readers will probably be supportive of those interpretations that support their own social and political values. Themes in American Educational History. Though this book contains a variety of historical interpretations, it is dominated by what I consider to be important historical themes. Any historian cannot write about all of the events and actions of a population in a given 24 hours or in a century. The historical writer must report on those events that they think are important. Therefore, I have selected certain themes that I consider important in the history of schooling. These themes are my interpretive perspective. Consequently, I have written thematic chapters rather than a purely sequential account. Because many of the chapters are thematic and cover similar periods of time at various intervals in the book, I provide timelines to help the readers understand the sequencing of events. In the remainder of this chapter, I will elaborate on the following historical themes. Globalization. Both the colonization of North America and the development of American schools occurred and continues to occur within the framework of global society. A major part of history in the U.S. schools involves conflict over culture and religion. Schools are one of many institutions that attempt to manage the distribution of ideas in society. I call this process ideological management. Educating immigrant populations has been a central concern of American schools. Racial and ethnic conflict is a central issue in U.S. history and in educational history. Economic goals are central to the evolution of U.S. schools. Consumerism and environmental education are pressing issues in the evolution of human society. Globalization framework. The development of American education was part of European imperialism, which involved not only the colonization of the Americas but also European expansion into Africa, Asia, and other parts of the world. In their quest for control of foreign lands, many of these imperial powers attempted to impose their schools, culture, and languages on local populations. Education as a form of cultural imperialism was aided by Christian missionaries who spread European ideas about schooling and culture. In North American colonies, missionaries hoped to use education to convert Native Americans to Christianity, which, it was hoped by some, would aid in the conquest of America's indigenous peoples. After the American Revolution, some American leaders called for a nationalistic education that would define the United States' identity and role in the global system of nations. With the advent of the Common School period in the 19th century, U.S. educators traveled to Europe to learn about educational systems. Many of the ideas learned abroad were incorporated into the U.S. school system. Today, there is a continuing global exchange of educational ideas and policies. The global movement of people has been central to America's school policies, from the early colonizations of the Americas and the massive immigration of the late 19th century to early 20th century to today's global movement of peoples. Some schools have been considered central to the assimilation of new population into American culture. Of course, this has sparked debates about what should be the culture and language of schooling. Today, school policies are framed in the language of global economic competition. Good schools are considered by many as essential for ensuring American power in a world of economic system. Human capital economics now dominates discussion of school reform. The promise of human capital economics is that investment in schools will result in better workers who will ensure economic growth. It is difficult to separate discussions of U.S. schools from those related to global education policies. Religious debates in U.S. schools from the colonial era to present. The 2016 election of President Donald Trump and the 2016 Republican Party platform highlighted the important role of religion in American education from colonial times to the present. As I will discuss in Chapter 2 on colonial education, Calvinism played an early role in shaping attitudes about the content of education, which continued in the 21st century with the appointment of Betsy DeVos as U.S. Secretary of Education, a graduate of Holland, Michigan Christian Schools and Calvin College. The Holland Christian Schools mission is to educate students to be biblically discerning, possess a knowledge of God's Word, understand and are able to defend a biblical worldview, able to critically evaluate the current culture in light of God's Word. Spiritually growing. Have a vibrant, growing relationship with God, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Understand their God-given design and desire to serve Jesus Christ in whatever they do. Calvin College proclaims Calvin's identity is a Christian academic community dedicated to rigorous intellectual inquiry. Religious debates about schools erupted in the 19th century, resulting, as I explain in Chapter 5, in the creation of the Catholic school system, which for many years existed as an alternative to the secular public school system. In the 20th century, religious debates erupted over the teaching of evolution, school prayer, and the reading of religious texts discussed in Chapter 15. These debates continued into the 21st century as exemplified by the 2016 Republican Party platform statement, a good understanding of the Bible being indispensable for the development of an education citizenry. We encourage state legislators to offer the Bible in a literature curriculum as an elective in America's high schools. As I explain in Chapter 15, U.S. Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos is motivated by Christian values to shape national education policies to allow for parental choice of religious schools. Schools and the Cultural Wars. Also central to the history of U.S. schools are debates about which cultural values should be taught in public schools. In the early years, public schools functioned to ensure the domination of Protestant Anglo-American culture in the United States. But as immigration increased from non-Protestant countries and minority cultures struggled for recognition, the schools became a battleground over multicultural education. Should schools support minority languages and cultures? Should schools only support English as the national language and only something called American culture? Should immigrants be Americanized in the schools, or should the schools support immigrant cultures, and a pluralistic society? These questions can cause emotional reactions. They should all become Americans, one person might angrily proclaim concerning immigrants, while another with equal emotion, fervor, might glorify the image of an American society that is multilingual and multicultural. Readers of this book will have differing reactions to cultural and language issues. Culture wars, the term originated with the work of Ira Shore, are a distinguishing characteristic of American history. English colonists declared their superiority over Native American cultures and attempted to impose their culture on Native Americans. Finding English cultures to be exploitative and repressive, Native Americans resisted attempts by colonists to transform their cultures. The hope of the leaders of the newly formed U.S. government was to create a national culture that would be unified around Protestant Anglo-American values. One reason for the 19th century development of public schools was to ensure the dominance of Anglo-American values that were being challenged by Irish immigrants, Native Americans, and African Americans. Public schools became defenders of Anglo-American values with each new wave of immigrants. In the 20th century, the cultural wars were characterized by Americanization programs, civil rights movements demanding representation of minority cultures in public schools, and the multicultural debate. The concept of cultural perspective is important for understanding the cultural wars. For instance, in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, some Native Americans decided that literacy might be an important tool for protecting their tribal lands and culture. In contrast, many whites considered the education of Native Americans as a means for acquiring Native American lands and transferring Native American cultures. This difference in perspective resulted both in major misunderstandings and in a cultural war that continues to the present. The mixture of cultures in the United States has resulted in the necessity of constantly asking, how do other cultures perceive this event? In the 19th century, many Irish Catholics believed the public schools were attempting to destroy the Catholic faith. In the 20th and 21st century, some religious groups protested the teaching of evolutionary theory and claimed that the secular values of schooling were undermining the morality of the nation. In the 20th century, many educators considered the development of separate curriculum tracks in high school as a means of serving individual differences. In contrast, many African Americans, Mexican Americans, and Native Americans considered separate curriculum tracks as another means of providing them with an inferior education. Schools as the managers of public thought. The culture wars are one aspect of what I call ideological management. Ideological management involves the creation and distribution of knowledge in a society. Schools play a central role in the distribution of particular knowledge to a society. Public schools were established to distribute knowledge to children and youth because knowledge is not neutral. A continuing debate exists about political, social, and economic content of schooling. There is a heated debate over the content and purpose of multicultural education in public schools. How this debate is decided will have important implications for shaping a student's perspective on the nature of society and politics in the United States. Recent historical interpretations stress the importance of the influence of differing political and economic groups on the content of knowledge and the cultural values distributed by schools. In the same fashion, political and economic pressure influence the knowledge and cultural values distributed by source other than educational institutions. Ideological management refers to the effect of these political and economic forces on the ideas disseminated to society. I include mass media along with public schools as important managers of ideas and cultural values disseminated to children and youth. Consequently, this book includes sections on the development of movies, radio, and television. In the 21st century, the media are considered the third educator of children, along with schools and the family. Currently, schools and the media compete for influence over children's minds and national culture. In the framework of ideological management, an important question is, what should be the culture or cultures of the public school curriculum? Should the population of the United States be united by a single culture, or should the United States be composed of distinct cultural traditions? What would North America be like today if English colonists had adopted cultural values of Native Americans? Racial and ethnic conflict as a theme in school history. Certainly a major strand of American history has been the quest for democracy and equality. However, another strand dating from the first arrival of English settlers is characterized by claims of racial and cultural superiority. The most violent and troubled parts of American history were a result of the clash between racism and demands for equality, including almost 1 million dead from the U.S. Civil War, the trail of tears covered by the bodies of European Americans and Native Americans who died as a result of the Indian Wars that began with the arrival of the first European settlers and lasted through the 19th century, the lynching and beating of Chinese in 19th century California, the killing and beating of enslaved Africans, the lynching and beating of African Americans during Reconstruction and segregation periods in the South, race riots in northern cities in the 19th and 20th centuries, the murder and beating of Mexican Americans during the Zoot Suit riots in 1943, the murders, riots, and church bombings during the civil rights struggles of the 1950s and 1960s, the continuing quest in the 21st century to reduce the achievement gap between racial and ethnic groups. Violence and racism are a basic part of American history and of the history of the school. From the colonial times to today, educators preached equality of opportunity and good citizenship while engaging in acts of religious intolerance, racial segregation, cultural genocide, and discrimination against immigrants and non-whites. Schooling has been plagued by scenes of violence, including urban riots between Protestants and Catholics in the 19th century, the punishment of enslaved Africans for learning to read, racial clashes over education of African Americans, Asians, Native Americans, and Mexican Americans, riots and killings over the integration of schools from the 1950s to the 1970s. It is important to understand that from colonial times to the present, racism and ethnic religious intolerance have been part of the beliefs in the republicanism, democracy, and equality held by some. I emphasize the word some. Americans of European descent. This intertwining of what on the surface appear to be contradictory beliefs has a major tragedy and a deep flaw from my perspective in the unfounding history of the United States and American schools. It is important to understand that for some Americans, racism and democracy are not conflicting beliefs, but are part of a general system of American values. Roger Smith contends in Civic Ideals, his massive and award-winning study of U.S. citizenship, that most historians neglect the importance of racist viewpoints in the forming of U.S. laws. As Smith demonstrates, history is characterized by a long tradition of discrimination and bigotry. After evaluating the combination of legal restrictions on voting rights and immigration and naturalization laws, Smith concludes that for over 80% of U.S. history, American laws declared most people in the world legally ineligible to become U.S. citizens solely because of their race, original nationality, or gender. For at least two-thirds of American history, the majority of the domestic adult population was also ineligible for full citizenship for the same reasons. Understanding how republicanism, democracy, and equality are compatible with racism and religious intolerance in some people's minds is key to understanding American violence and the often tragic history of education. However, I want to emphasize that many Americans of European descent have fought against racism and religious bigotry. For those believing in racial equality, the European Americans who were abolitionists and civil rights advocates are the real exemplars of democracy and equality in American history. The role in educational history of equality, of opportunity, and human capital. With the founding of common schools in the early 19th century, education was hailed as a means of ending poverty, providing equality of opportunity, and increasing national wealth. These grandiose claims continued into the 20th century with a strong emphasis on schools selecting students and preparing them for different segments of the labor market. Standardized tests, ability grouping in elementary school classrooms, and the separation of high school students into different educational programs ranging from college preparatory to vocational training were considered key components in linking schools to the economy. In the 1960s, many people believed that the educational components of the federal government's so-called war on poverty were the key to ending poverty. These war on poverty programs include Head Start, compensatory programs in reading and math, and the television program Sesame Street. In the 1970s, the magic bullet for the economy was career education. Different from vocational education, career education involved the actual study of jobs. Career education appeared in schools in the form of career education fairs, actual career education courses, career counselors, and classroom literature containing job descriptions. In the 1980s, many corporate and government leaders blamed the schools for the declining ability of the United States to compete in the world economy. During the 1980s and 1990s, a major goal of public schools became the education of workers who would increase the ability of U.S. corporations to dominate world markets. Throughout all these periods, debates continued about the purpose of these goals and whether they were attainable. Were some people arguing that schools could eliminate poverty because they did not want to change the economic system? Did the schools become a scapegoat for the continuing existence of poverty? Could, in fact, the public school actually end poverty? Did attempts to end poverty through schooling actually ensure economic inequality? Were lower wages, increased profits, and control of workers the real reason why politicians and corporate leaders wanted schools to educate students to meet the needs of the labor market? How did education for the labor market affect citizenship education? Whose values dominated the citizenship education? Should students be educated to help U.S. corporations dominate world markets? These debates have a central role in shaping the destiny of U.S. schools. Consequently, my framework for interpreting educational history includes, along with cultural domination, ideological management, and racism, a discussion of economic issues. However, the final decision about the meaning of history belongs to you. Globalization, consumer and environmental education. In the 1970s, the consumerist ideology that dominated American education in the 20th century was criticized because of the environmental damage it was causing. Consumerism, an economic philosophy born in the 1890s, assumes that the ideal economic system is one that continually grows and develops new products. In this framework, the key to economic growth is the endless consumption of new industrial products. Late 19th century economists worried that industrial efficiency would reduce the time people spent working and that the result would be social decay as people searched for ways of utilizing greater leisure time. The antidote to the potentially decadent world of leisure time was the idea that people should be spurred to work harder to consume more goods. Home economics instructions in public schools played a major role in introducing women to the ideology of the consumer society. In addition, children and particularly high school students were considered an important consumer market. The word teenager was created to define these new adolescent consumers. Environmental educators have called for a shift from the industrial consumer paradigm to a biospheric paradigm. The biospheric paradigm considers the earth and all species of animals and plants as an interrelated and dependent system. Sustainable development and sustainable consumption are now goals of many environmental educators as they try to limit the damage caused by the consumerist ideology. In schools in the 21st century, there is a struggle between commercial interests that continue to promote consumerism and environmental educators and students who are thinking within the biospheric paradigm.